a lost stand in the California, somewhere between the modest neon lights of San Bernardino and the endless roar of cars crossing Route 66. The story of two brothers began to rise. Brothers who, without intending to, would shape one of the most influential business empires of the 20th century. It was 1940, a year in which the United States still breathed an air of prosperity before the storm. With families beginning to adopt the automobile as a natural extension of their daily lives, and with dozens of small businesses trying to take advantage of the constant flow of travelers, workers, and the curious. In that context, Richard and Maurice McDonald opened their small food stand every morning, an establishment that did not attract much attention, but that had something special in the meticulous way both of them cared for every detail. As if they sensed that the way they organized their kitchen could make the difference in an increasingly competitive environment. Before continuing, I am very curious to know from what part of the world and at what time you are joining tonight. I would love to read you in the comments, because it is always fascinating to discover how far these stories travel. Just like those drivers who, without realizing it, ended up pulling into that small place that was about to challenge the old rules of the restaurant business. Even though at that moment, no one, not even its owners, suspected what was coming. The McDonald brothers did not have a master plan or a business presentation worthy of a Wall Street investor. They had something much simpler and at the same time, much more powerful. The ability to observe how their restaurant worked day after day, and the patience to understand that if they wanted to survive, they needed to reinvent themselves. Their story begins with previous attempts, discrete failures, and a determination forged more in daily struggle than in grand visions. They had tried their luck with movie theaters, with different food formats, even with vending machines. And in every attempt they encountered obstacles that forced them to recalculate their path, adjusting expectations and keeping their focus on the only thing they were always clear about. They wanted to build a stable business that would allow them to live well, without luxuries, but with peace of mind. The place they had at the time was a typical drive-in of the era, with car hops on roller skates carrying trays to the cars, a large menu, and a dynamic that depended too much on external factors. Long waiting times, order mistakes, constant waste, and employee turnover that complicated daily operations. Even so, the restaurant was popular among young people and workers in the area, although that popularity did not translate into a sustainable model. Every night, when they pulled down the shutters, the brothers stayed behind, analyzing numbers and discussing whether that format really had a future, because they sensed that competition would tighten and that maintaining such a large menu was a losing battle. As time went by, this almost obsessive analysis began to shape an idea that still had no name, but that was starting to take form in both of their minds. They asked themselves why people came back to their restaurant, which product was the most requested, which part of the menu generated the most complications, and which elements could be simplified to offer faster and more efficient service. Through these observations, without haste and without the immediate intention of revolutionizing anything, they came to understand that the hamburger, the French fries, and the milkshakes represented the solid foundation of their business, and that everything else distracted, made it more expensive, and hindered smooth operation. As these reflections progressed, the classic drive-in began to feel like a suit that no longer fit them, a format that had worked out of habit, but that did not adapt to the operational reality they wanted to achieve. The night became their best ally to imagine a kitchen organized almost like a synchronized machine, where every movement had a clear purpose and every employee knew exactly what to do in every second of service. That idea had not fully crystallized yet, but it was already hinted at in the way they reorganized the pantry, adjusted the grill, or rethought the workstations. Between discussions, tests, and small daily changes, the brothers began to mentally dismantle their own business in order to rebuild it from scratch. Something not all entrepreneurs are willing to do when the business, at least on the surface, works. But they were not looking for momentary success, nor did they want to live forever on the edge of financial uncertainty. Their goal was to perfect a system that would allow them to sleep peacefully, knowing that every hamburger coming off the grill was made in less time, with fewer mistakes, and with more consistency than the one before. What is interesting about this stage is that everything developed naturally, without the rush of someone trying to impress an investor or the anxiety of modern businesses that seem to be obliged to grow from the very first minute. The McDonald brothers were creating something new without knowing it. A model born from experience, observation, and a peculiar mix of moderate ambition and artisanal discipline. And while the sun set behind the Californian hills, they kept reviewing improvised plans, moving tables, and dreaming of a restaurant that worked with the precision of a clock. That process of reinvention would mark a before and after in their story. A moment that would transform an ordinary drive-in into the laboratory, where a concept would be born that would soon catch the attention of thousands of customers. And later on, of a man who would see in that system the seed of an empire. And with that idea germinating among grills and trays, we approach the stage where the brothers' kitchen would stop being a simple roadside place and become a machine designed to change everything. The Speedee service system revolution. When the McDonald brothers decided that that drive-in filled with roller skating waitresses, endless menus, and messy tickets no longer fit the vision of stability they were pursuing, they made a radical decision for a business that was working reasonably well. They closed the restaurant for several months and began to dismantle it piece by piece, not to give up, but to rebuild it with a completely different logic, almost industrial, as if they were designing a hamburger factory instead of a simple roadside food joint. And that shift in mindset would mark the birth of something the world still did not have a name to describe, but that over time would be understood as the essence of modern fast food. What was interesting about the process was not only the final result, but the almost obsessive way in which they worked on the system, because the brothers did not limit themselves to changing the decor or trimming the menu a little, but took their desire for order to an almost surgical level, starting with a decision that today seems obvious, but at the time felt almost aggressive. Reducing the menu to the bare minimum, focusing on hamburgers, French fries, soft drinks, and milkshakes, and accepting that everything else distracted, generated errors, and slowed down the operation, while concentrating energy on just a few products allowed them to standardize times, quantities, and movements with a precision that no other roadside restaurant was even considering. The scene that best summarizes that transformation is almost cinematic. The brothers, together with their team, marking with chalk on a tennis court the positions of each workstation in the future kitchen, walking up and down as if they were choreographing a play, simulating the path of each employee, the position of each machine, the exact space needed to move without colliding, rehearsing with imaginary plates how the workflow should circulate from the moment an order came in until the hamburger was handed to the customer, and correcting the layout again and again until they found the most fluid design. The one that turned the kitchen into a kind of assembly line that looked more like an industrial plant than a classic food establishment. That moment, seemingly simple and almost improvised, is a pure business lesson, because it shows how a business transforms when the entrepreneur stops seeing the restaurant as a place where things happen and starts looking at it as a system in which every step can be measured, optimized, and perfected, and in which nothing is left to chance. Not the placement of the grill, not the height of the counter, not the distance between the fryer station and the area where the hamburgers are assembled. The result of all that work was the famous Speedee service system, an operating model in which each employee had a very specific and well-defined task. So there were no longer cooks improvising depending on the day, but rather a chain of repeatable and predictable actions. One handled the meat, another the buns, another the final assembly, another the packaging. And everyone moved to the rhythm of a shared logic that prioritized speed, consistency, and the reduction of the margin of error to a minimum. The kitchen stopped being a chaotic space where each order was a small adventure and became a repetitive but tremendously efficient machine. In parallel, the brothers structured every detail of production. The size of the hamburgers, the exact number of pickles, the amount of sauce, the cooking time, the doneness of the meat, the oil temperature for the fries, and everything was written down, tested, measured again, and adjusted until they achieved a combination that guaranteed that every customer who ordered a hamburger would receive practically the same experience, regardless of the day or the shift. That obsession with uniformity was not an aesthetic whim, but a strategy to gain efficiency and credibility. Because when the customer knows what to expect, they return with fewer doubts and recommend the place with greater confidence. Another decisive element was the change in the way customers were served. The roller skating waitresses who went out to the cars disappeared, and a system was implemented in which the customer got out of the vehicle, placed the order at the counter, and received the food in a matter of seconds, without table service, without embellishments, and without distractions. This detail, which for many businesses of the time would have been a sacrifice of the traditional charm of the drive-in, for the McDonald brothers was an operational liberation because it simplified the path of the order, reduced staffing costs, and shortened waiting times, to the point that many people could not quite understand how it was possible for the food to arrive so fast. Speed became the most visible hook of the new system. But beneath that speed, there was a silent engineering based on something entrepreneurs today are still chasing. Clear processes, well-defined roles, elimination of repetitive errors, and extreme focus on what truly generates value for the customer. The hamburger was not a sophisticated gastronomic creation. It was a product designed to be repeatable, affordable, and predictable. And precisely for that reason, it became the central piece of the mechanism. When they reopened the restaurant after that deep transformation, it no longer functioned like any ordinary drive-in. It was a perfect gear in which the customer barely needed to wait. The staff knew exactly what to do at every moment, and the business could calculate its margins, its times, and its daily capacities with much greater precision, giving it a huge advantage over competitors who were still trapped in slow systems based on overly long menus and disorganized kitchens. Suddenly, what had been born as an internal adjustment to improve a specific business began to look like something that could be replicated elsewhere. Even though at that moment, the brothers were more focused on perfecting their store than on building a national chain, the results did not take long to arrive. Customer volume increased, waiting times collapsed, and word of mouth began to attract people who came from farther away just to experience something so different, where the food appeared in front of the customer with a speed that broke with everything considered normal in a restaurant of the time. The business no longer depended so much on the charisma of the staff or the charm of the format. It depended on a solid system. And when a business rests on a well-built system, it begins to have something many entrepreneurs pursue for years: predictability. And while in San Bernardino, the line in front of the counter kept growing and the kitchen ran like a well-oiled clock, that small experiment began to stand out on the map of the United States as a peculiar model that caught the attention of those who knew how to look beyond the surface to the point that, sooner or later, someone with an expansive mindset and an enormous hunger for opportunities would take notice of that perfect gear and imagine it multiplied across the entire country, transforming that orderly kitchen into the foundation of a much more ambitious project. Ray Kroc enters the scene. While in San Bernardino, hamburgers were coming out in an assembly line, and the McDonald brothers system was beginning to turn into a small local attraction. In another part of the country, a tireless salesman kept traveling highways with a briefcase full of promises and a calendar packed with client visits that, in many cases, people did not even remember agreeing to. That salesman was called Ray Kroc, and his life up to that point was the biography of someone who had spent an entire career chasing an opportunity that felt definitive, jumping from one job to another, with a mix of perseverance, restlessness, and ambition that, for many, bordered on extreme stubbornness. Ray Kroc had worked as a pianist in bars, as a sales manager for all kinds of products, and at the key moment of this story, he made his living selling milkshake machines called multi-mixer, devices capable of preparing several milkshakes simultaneously, something that on paper sounded fantastic for any restaurant with a reasonable volume of customers, but that in practice required the place to have enough demand to justify that investment. So Kroc's task was not as simple as knocking on a door and closing a sale, but rather a daily battle against the skepticism of owners who saw the future with far less enthusiasm than he tried to convey. His routine consisted of hour after hour driving along endless roads, visiting large and small establishments, drinking bad coffee, listening to restaurateurs' complaints, insisting with demonstrations, doing the math with them on napkins, enduring refusals, and, from time to time, celebrating a purchase that gave him back enough energy to keep going. Convinced that somewhere on the map there was a client, a business, a project that would fit perfectly with what he was selling. A meeting point between his own need to succeed and the right model to make it happen. It was precisely an administrative signal, cold and apparently routine, that opened the door to that meeting. From the company that distributed the multi-mixer, someone noticed that a small restaurant in San Bernardino was ordering several machines at once. More than made sense for an ordinary place. And that statistical anomaly sparked Kroc's curiosity. He had been pounding the pavement for so long that he could immediately tell when a data point broke the monotony. So he decided to see with his own eyes what was happening there. Because for a salesman with his mindset, an unusual order was not just another invoice. It was a clue to something that could be bigger. When Ray arrived in San Bernardino and parked in front of the McDonald location, what he saw was a modest establishment, without grand pretensions, with a simple facade and a steady line of customers waiting with a different kind of patience, almost resigned yet confident at the same time. As if they knew the wait was worth it, because on the other side of the counter, there was a system that worked with uncommon efficiency. He observed how orders came out one after another, how people received their bags and stepped aside quickly, how the employees moved almost in unison, and how behind that rhythm there was not chaos disguised as order, but a structure designed down to the millimeter. Kroc was especially impressed by the contrast between the simplicity of the menu and the volume of customers. Few options, very clearly defined products, zero complications, and yet a constant rotation of people that seemed not to stop throughout the day. He, who had seen overwhelmed kitchens, endless menus, and places unable to keep calm during peak hours, suddenly found himself facing a model that challenged his previous references and that, moreover, fit perfectly with the type of machine he sold. Because a place that served so many milkshakes and hamburgers in so little time required reliable tools capable of keeping up without breaking down. When he finally made contact with the McDonald brothers, what he found were two practical men, more focused on keeping their system finely tuned than on delivering grand speeches about the future. Owners of a kitchen that already worked like a clock and that, in their minds, represented the culmination of years of adjustments, difficult decisions, and constant testing. For them, the restaurant was a finished work, something that had reached a very reasonable level of functional perfection, and that guaranteed them a comfortable, stable life without excess. For Kroc, on the other hand, it was a prototype, a base model crying out to be replicated in multiple cities, a multiplying effect the brothers could not quite visualize. Ray began to ask questions, to take an interest in the numbers, the speed of service, the cost of ingredients, customer satisfaction. And as he listened to the answers, his mind went far beyond the San Bernardino parking lot, imagining scenarios where that same design was planted near heavily traveled highways, in rapidly growing neighborhoods, in cities where an accelerated lifestyle demanded fast, cheap, and reliable solutions for eating out without complications. In his head, every grill, every cash register, and every counter could be reproduced again and again, like pieces of a network that would cover the entire country. Kroc's personality played a fundamental role here, because he was not content with appreciating a good system from a distance. He needed to get inside, to get involved, to propose, to negotiate. And he had the ability to wrap his ambition in a discourse of collaboration that at first sounded friendly and reasonable. At 50 years old, he was not the profile of a young entrepreneur starting from scratch, but a man coming from decades of trial and error, of jobs that never quite solidified, of half-finished projects. And that is why, when he saw that kitchen in operation, he interpreted it as the last great opportunity of his life. One of those doors that, if you do not walk through at the right moment, close forever. With that sense of urgency, Kroc began to propose to the brothers the idea of expanding the concept through franchises, explaining that the system they had designed had a very important quality. It was replicable. Instead of a single restaurant, one could imagine a chain of locations operating under the same rules, with the same reduced menu, the same organization, and the same promise of speed and price. He offered himself as the man willing to travel the country, to find partners, to supervise the implementation of the model, to push the growth that they, by character and mindset, were not pursuing with the same intensity. The conversation between those worlds, that of two craftsman brothers obsessed with detail, and that of a salesman who thought in terms of scale and expansion, gave rise to an alliance as powerful as it was conflictive, which at first carried an air of shared enthusiasm and common project, but that contained an invisible tension within it. The difference between someone who feels his work is finished and someone who sees it only as the beginning. And as Kroc left San Bernardino with the image of that kitchen engraved in his mind, he was already beginning to mentally design the map of what, for him, could become a national network of restaurants, a plan that would soon start to take shape in contracts, manuals, and agreements with future franchisees. From that point on, the history of McDonald's would stop being contained in a single location and would begin to write a new chapter, one in which the word growth would become the key to every decision, with Kroc leading an offensive that would transform a Californian experiment into a brand destined to spread across dozens of cities, bringing to the surface differences in vision that, in that first meeting in San Bernardino, were still sleeping beneath the initial courtesy. The dream of a national franchises. When Ray Kroc left San Bernardino with that system etched into his mind, the map of the United States stopped being a simple succession of states and highways and became, in his imagination, a grid full of potential points where that model could come to life again and again. As if every major city deserved its own version of that perfectly organized kitchen. With the same sign, the same short menu, and the same unceasing flow of customers he had seen lining up in California. What for the McDonald brothers was a solid, well-rounded, almost definitive business. For Kroc turned into a prototype, into version 1 of an idea that could be scaled to a dimension they had not contemplated. And that difference in perception pushed him to act with the energy of someone who feels he has finally found the right lever to move his destiny. The conversations with the brothers began cautiously, with Kroc explaining that the true value of what they had created was not limited to the restaurant in San Bernardino, but lay in the system, in the methodology, in that invisible choreography that allowed a group of employees, without being renowned chefs, to produce hundreds of hamburgers a day with an admirable level of consistency. He insisted that what they had on their hands was a replicable format, something capable of working in different cities if the right people were found to become franchisees, local owners willing to invest their money to open restaurants under the McDonald's brand by following strict rules. The brothers listened with interest, but their priorities were different. They felt satisfied with their business, valued the stability they had achieved after years of setbacks, and looked at the idea of growing too fast with a mix of caution and skepticism, fearing that an uncontrolled rollout could ruin what had cost them so much to perfect. For Richard and Maurice, the beauty of their model lay in direct control, in being able to supervise quality with their own eyes, in knowing the employees and correcting them on the spot. While Kroc thought in terms of manuals, rules, contracts, and mechanisms to transfer that discipline to people who might never set foot in California. In the end, they reached an agreement. Kroc would have the license to develop franchises under the McDonald's brand, on the condition that he respected the original system and maintained the standards the brothers considered non-negotiable. He would take care of finding locations, negotiating contracts, selecting franchisees, and overseeing the launch of each new restaurant, while the McDonald's would receive a share of the income derived from that growth. On paper, the structure sounded reasonable. They defended their creation. He expanded it. In practice, it was the beginning of a tension that would grow with each new step. Ray Kroc, now with a legal framework backing his moves, set out to travel the country with an enthusiasm that bordered on obsession. He went from city to city, observing neighborhoods, measuring car traffic, studying the competition, imagining where the next location with its clean design, striking arches, and the promise of fast, cheap, and consistent food would fit best. At the same time, he searched for the right candidates to become franchisees, people who did not intend to reinvent the concept, but to replicate it with discipline, accepting a rigid operating structure and meticulous control from the central organization. One of the key milestones of this stage was the opening of the Des Plaines restaurant in Illinois in 1955, which Kroc managed almost as his flagship, the perfect showcase to show future franchisees what the McDonald's model meant beyond San Bernardino. That opening was, in a sense, his declaration of intent. The location had a carefully designed aesthetic, a parking lot planned for a constant flow of vehicles, a kitchen organized down to the smallest detail, and a team trained under the idea that every second mattered, that every gesture was aligned with a promise of service. The first franchisees who joined the project arrived with enthusiasm and money, but also with habits typical of those who were used to running their businesses their own way. Both Kroc and the brothers quickly discovered that expanding through franchises meant fighting against each owner's natural tendency to introduce changes, add products, adapt the menu to personal tastes, or relaxed standards of cleanliness and service times. For the brothers, any variation was a threat to the essence of their system. For Kroc, it was a daily battle that required a mix of diplomacy and firmness to steer those partners back toward the original script. At this stage, a difference in approach became evident that would later weigh heavily. The McDonald's continued to see the company from the perspective of the craftsman who protects his work, while Kroc began to see himself as a builder of networks, someone who had to put growth above any personal comfort. He spent entire stretches on the road, visiting locations, reviewing facilities, sending letters and internal circulars with detailed instructions, imposing rules on product uniformity, building design, employee training, and even attitude toward the customer. The pace of expansion, however, was not as dizzying as he would have liked at first. Skeptical investors had to be convinced, licenses managed, local regulations adapted to, teams trained, logistical problems solved. And each new restaurant required an investment of time and energy that wore down anyone who did not have an almost fanatical conviction in the long-term vision. Ray did have it. He got up early, took calls, reviewed sales reports, ran numbers with very tight margins, and got back into the car or onto a plane to show up in another city and repeat, once again, the speech about the business opportunity represented by opening a McDonald's. Meanwhile, in San Bernardino, the brothers watched the process with a mix of pride, distance, and concern. They saw how their system began to appear reflected in other cities, knew their surname was starting to roll across the map, but also felt the unease of someone who senses that the creation is slowly moving away from their direct control. Each time a conflict arose with a franchisee, a quality problem, or a serious complaint, the need appeared to decide who had the final say, whether it was the founders who had conceived the model or the partner who was giving his life to take that model to new frontiers. Kroc, for his part, began to feel that the initial agreement constrained him in certain aspects, that some limits imposed by the brothers hindered the speed he wanted to give the project, and that feeling of internal friction grew in parallel with the number of locations opened. From his point of view, the country was a board full of empty squares that needed to be occupied as soon as possible, before another chain, another entrepreneur, or any competitor got ahead with a similar system. In his mind, urgency was constant, while the brothers valued caution and the preservation of their way of understanding the business. That difference in pace, in appetite for risk, and in ambition of scale became a silent line that increasingly separated the two worlds, that of the original kitchen in San Bernardino and that of the offices and endless journeys of Ray Kroc across the rest of the country. And as the number of franchises grew, so did the need to define who truly ruled the story of McDonald's, preparing the ground for a clash of visions that could no longer be resolved solely with goodwill and verbal agreements. Clash of visions. Artisans versus empire. As the number of franchises grew and Ray Kroc traveled across the country driving new openings with a mix of enthusiasm and constant pressure, the differences between his way of understanding the business and the mindset of the McDonald brothers began to surface in conversations, administrative decisions, and small frictions that at first seemed like simple differences of judgment, but that little by little took on a deeper, almost structural tone. At their core, two worlds were beginning to collide. Worlds that had coexisted peacefully while expansion was limited. But that could hardly remain aligned when the project started to take on proportions that no founder had imagined in the early days in San Bernardino. For Richard and Morris, the story of McDonald's was still an intimate one. They saw the restaurant as the culmination of years of experimentation, a system created with an almost artisanal level of care. where every detail had a clear purpose and every decision sought to protect an essence they considered sacred. In their eyes, the San Bernardino location was not simply a profitable business. It was a work of culinary engineering, a demonstration that discipline and clarity could turn a simple kitchen into a perfectly synchronized organism. Their identity was deeply tied to that place, to its organization, to the exact way employees moved their hands to assemble a hamburger or lifted the potatoes from the oil. Ray Kroc, by contrast, looked at that same restaurant as a seed designed to multiply. Where the brothers saw a process refined to the point of excellence, he saw a manual that needed to be replicated in 50, 100, or 1,000 establishments across the entire territory. His energy was directed toward growth, toward building a national network that would allow any customer in any city to walk into a McDonald's and find the same experience as in California. That ambition, which at first seemed like an interesting addition, turned over the months into a force that pushed the project into territory where the brothers' direct control began to lose relevance. Tensions manifested in various ways. One of the most recurring had to do with Kroc's obsession with maintaining a uniform standard across all franchises, because he knew that if even a single location introduced variations, the brand was exposed to the risk of dilution before it could consolidate itself. For him, consistency was a strategic pillar, and any franchisee who wanted to add an item to the menu, change a procedure, or modify a recipe had to receive a quick and firm reprimand. However, whenever a conflict arose with a rebellious franchisee, the McDonald brothers did not share the same level of severity. They tended to adopt a more patient approach, convinced that small adjustments could be controlled if they were supervised frequently. That clash of attitudes fed a growing sense of frustration in Kroc, because every exception seemed to him like an unnecessary risk, and because he was convinced that the structure of the company needed to be professionalized much faster than the brothers were willing to accept. While he sent out circulars with new rules or proposed changes to the agreements to strengthen the power of the central office, the McDonald's reviewed every document with caution, fearing that those measures would end up turning the company into something they no longer recognized as their own. Important differences also emerged around money. Although the brand was beginning to place itself on the map, the company's margins were narrow, and the revenue model established in the initial contract left Kroc with a small proportion of the profits generated by the franchises. This point began to weigh on him more and more, because his life had been reduced to constant travel, endless responsibilities, and an enormous personal effort that found no direct reflection in his bank account. That pressure led him to look for alternatives, to imagine new ways of structuring the business that would allow him to balance his efforts with his income. Something the brothers viewed with unease, because they sensed that behind those ideas, there was a change that could alter the essence of the original agreement. On the other hand, communication between the parties became more strained as physical and emotional distance increased. The brothers continued to manage their restaurant with the calm style that had always characterized them, while Kroc faced rapid decisions, operational emergencies, legal problems, disputes among franchisees, and logistical issues every day, issues that could not wait. That difference in working speed generated a sense of being out of sync. For the McDonald's, Ray was moving too fast. For Ray, they were moving too slowly. Although everything was handled with courtesy at first, that courtesy gradually became more fragile, more susceptible to small offenses or misunderstandings. The brothers began to feel that their own creation was slipping out of their control, that the brand carried their surname, but that the most important decisions were shifting toward a partner who seemed to have a different vision, almost incompatible with theirs. Ray, for his part, perceived a constant break, a barrier that forced him to justify every move, when he believed the company needed to move forward without so many concessions in order not to miss its historic opportunity. Some specific episodes illustrate this tension well. Every time Kroc negotiated a franchise contract, he had to adjust to conditions he considered excessively rigid, imposed by the brothers to protect the system. Every time he proposed an investment in advertising, a new store design, or a more aggressive expansion strategy, he was met with doubts, objections, and requests for review. These back-and-forth exchanges consumed time and energy, and fed in him a growing conviction. The future of McDonald's needed more centralized leadership, more decisive, and less dependent on the founder's pace. That conclusion, however, was not expressed out loud right away. On the contrary, it took shape in silence, as Kroc accumulated frustrations and developed an increasingly intense determination to find a definitive solution. Inside him, a certainty was growing. If he wanted to take the brand to the place he imagined, he needed more control. And if the brothers were not willing to give it to him, sooner or later he would have to look for an alternative path. The conflict was no longer a matter of ego or management styles. It was becoming a dispute over the soul of the company, over what McDonald's should be in the future and who had the authority to define that course. What had begun as a promising alliance was turning into a relationship marked by wear, distrust, and the sense, especially on Kroc's side, that the current model could not be sustained for much longer without a profound change. In that charged climate, the story moved toward a point where tensions could not remain in an indefinite state. They needed to be resolved in some way, and that resolution would open the door to the most decisive transformation of the entire McDonald's project. Against that backdrop, the relationship between the founders and their main partner was beginning to head into a phase in which financial strategies and contractual decisions would become the main weapons of a silent battle for absolute control. The master move: land and brick. At the beginning of the 1950s decade, while the McDonald brothers remained immersed in the daily operation of their restaurant, and Ray Kroc traveled across the country trying to convince new franchisees, the company was beginning to run into a limit that had nothing to do with the kitchen, the customers, or the employees, but with something much deeper: the financial model that sustained the business. Each new franchise generated income, but the profits that the central organization received were far too small to compensate for the titanic effort that Kroc invested in expansion. The commissions agreed upon with the brothers were fixed and relatively modest. And although each opening represented a small step forward in his vision of national scale, the money that actually remained in his hands was not enough to consolidate sustained growth. That imbalance began to generate in Kroc an uncomfortable, almost suffocating feeling, because the days were filled with travel, meetings, and negotiations, while inside him the economic pressure continued to grow. The franchises worked, but the cash flow did not reflect the volume of work. This situation, combined with the growing tension with the McDonald brothers, led Ray to seek a solution that would break through the limits of the original contract. An alternative path that did not depend on the constant approval of the founders and that, at the same time, would allow him to obtain real, tangible, and sufficient income to finance expansion. The key appeared thanks to a collaborator who understood the problem from a completely different angle. Harry Sonneborn, an executive with a sharp strategic vision and an exceptional ability to see opportunities where others only saw obstacles. He was the one who put on the table an idea that, in retrospect, seems as obvious as it is revolutionary, but that at the time was a genuine revelation. McDonald's should not make money only by selling hamburgers. It had to make money by controlling the land on which the restaurants were built. In other words, Sonneborn proposed to Kroc that the company stopped thinking of itself solely as a food business and began to operate as a real estate business that used franchises as a source of stable rents. The idea consisted of creating a parallel company in charge of buying the land where the new restaurants would be located and then leasing it to the franchisees on a long-term basis, with a margin sufficient to generate sustained income, both in times of prosperity and in more difficult moments. This move completely changed the economic balance. Hamburger sales could fluctuate, but the rent of a well-located property was a constant and predictable source of income. For Kroc, who had spent months feeling trapped by a system that did not allow him to move forward at the speed he desired, that proposal was an almost immediate relief. The model solved several problems at once. It gave him a source of income independent of the McDonald brothers, strengthened his ability to control franchisees, and allowed expansion to no longer depend on a rigid structure. In addition, it transformed the company into a much more powerful organization because the acquired land became assets that increased in value over time, building equity that had not existed before. The creation of this parallel company, called Franchise Realty Corporation, was one of the most decisive strategic moves in the history of McDonald's. From that moment on, whenever a franchisee became interested in opening a restaurant, the company could offer a much more complete package. Not only a proven system, a standardized menu, and a recognizable brand, but also the possibility of installing the location on land whose lease guaranteed that all restaurants operated under a coherent financial structure. Moreover, this mechanism gave Kroc a fundamental advantage. If a franchisee breached the contract or failed to meet the required standards, the company had the authority to take the location away because it owned the land. This point is key to understanding how McDonald's went from being an innovative hamburger restaurant to becoming a corporate giant. Thanks to control of the ground, Kroc gained a lever of power that he had not had before. He no longer depended exclusively on the will of the brothers or on the tight margins of food sales. He had a tool that, in the hands of someone determined and ambitious, could completely transform the playing field. Meanwhile, the brothers observed this evolution from a certain distance, perhaps without fully understanding the implications of the real estate strategy, although they did not openly oppose it either. They remained focused on the operation of the original restaurant and on protecting the system, while Ray and Sonneborn designed the corporate architecture that would shape the future of the chain. This disconnect between what the founders understood as the heart of the project and what Kroc was building in parallel became more evident over time. For the McDonald's, the essence was in the kitchen. For Kroc, the key was in the structure that allowed the kitchen to be replicated thousands of times. As the new financial model took hold, revenues began to rise noticeably. The company now had an internal source that allowed it to cover expenses, invest in advertising, open new markets, and negotiate more strategic locations without depending on the specific profitability of each restaurant. This economic solidity fueled faster growth, generated confidence among potential partners, and reinforced Ray's image as the true engine of the project. This progress, however, intensified the tension with the brothers. In more than one meeting, Ray expressed his frustration with the restrictions of the original contract, while the McDonald's, increasingly uneasy, perceived that the project was transforming into something that was slipping out of their control. The difference in priorities became more evident. They wanted to preserve the essence of the initial model, while he sought to consolidate a structure that guaranteed the massive expansion of the brand. With the company expanding at an accelerating pace, the imbalance of power became impossible to ignore. Kroc now managed the assets, controlled the land, negotiated with the banks, and had access to a network of franchisees who trusted him more than the founders. The brothers, for their part, continued to receive their percentage, but their real capacity to influence the direction of the project diminished more and more. Sonneborn's master move was not only a brilliant financial strategy, it was the move that definitively tipped the balance in favor of Ray Kroc, giving him the structure necessary to assume virtually total control when the time came to negotiate ownership of the brand. With this new power accumulating in his hands, and with the conviction that the future had to be built without hesitation, Ray Kroc began to prepare the ground for an even deeper change, a transformation that would forever mark the history of McDonald's, and that would put an end to the ambiguous relationship between the founders and the man who had decided to turn their invention into an empire. The purchase of the McDonald's surname. When the real estate business began to consolidate and the franchises moved forward with a force that no longer depended on the constant approval of the brothers, Ray Kroc realized that he had reached a position from which he could consider something that years earlier would have seemed impossible: taking full control of the company. The brand still belonged to Richard and Maurice. The name was registered under their ownership, and every move that involved changing a core rule, opening a new market, or redefining the strategy required, in theory, their consent. For a man with the level of ambition and the business momentum he had been accumulating, that scenario was beginning to feel incompatible with his expansion plans. The relationship between both worlds was worn down. Meetings no longer had the cordiality of the early days. When they sat down to talk, the brothers saw Kroc as a partner who had gone too far, a man whose enthusiasm had crossed the line between collaboration and domination. He, on the other hand, saw two founders anchored to an idea of stability that had become too small compared to what the brand could become. The distance that had once shown itself in operational details now carried an evident emotional weight, as if all three knew they were approaching a point where the bond would eventually break. Kroc was clear that if he wanted McDonald's to become the largest chain in the country and in the world, he had to make sure that no key decision depended on people who did not share his vision. The real estate model already gave him a decisive strategic advantage, but there was still a fundamental obstacle. The brand was not his. He could open restaurants, control land, impose standards, and direct expansion. But the surname that appeared on the signs was still the property of the brothers who had invented the system. In that context, he began to consider the complete purchase of the company. It was not a simple process, because it meant negotiating with two men who had a deep emotional bond with their creation, and who in no way saw the sale as just another business transaction. For them, McDonald's was the result of years of work, adjustments, failures, and difficult decisions. Seeing their surname change hands carried a meaning that went far beyond money. However, the pressure was growing. The personal relationship was deteriorated. Growth was advancing so quickly that it was difficult to maintain calm conversations, and the power structure leaned more toward Kroc with each passing day. The dynamic had changed in such a way that the brothers could no longer influence the course of the company in the same way as before. And this led them to a mix of resignation, wounded pride, and exhaustion from constant tensions. In 1961, after months of discussions, tense meetings, and financial calculations, Kroc presented a final offer: $2,700,000 to buy the business outright, free the brothers from their responsibilities in the company, and take full control of the brand. An amount that, adjusted to the standards of the time, seemed significant, but that did not even remotely reflect the real potential that the system was about to develop under an unrestrained direction. The negotiation was complex because the brothers wanted to make sure that the original restaurant in San Bernardino could continue to exist outside the corporate network. From their perspective, that location was the emotional heart of the project. Its symbol, the place where everything had begun. Their desire was to keep it, to maintain it under their operation without interference from the new company led by Kroc. For them, this was a matter of identity, history, and personal memory. Ray verbally accepted, according to multiple testimonies, that they could continue managing that restaurant. It is said that there was even a handshake, an informal gesture that the brothers interpreted as a firm commitment. But that agreement was never reflected in the final contract. And when all the signatures were in place, when the operation was legally closed, when Kroc became the absolute owner of the brand, the interpretation of that gesture turned into a silent dispute that would leave a bitter taste for the founders. Shortly afterward, Ray opened a new McDonald's very close to the original location, an action that directly affected the brothers' restaurant, which would end up closing sometime later. That outcome became one of the most controversial parts of the entire history of the company, fueling for decades the debate over who was right, who acted fairly, and who was overtaken by the relentless logic of business. For Kroc, the purchase of the brand was a necessary strategic move, the final piece of a puzzle he had been assembling for years with patience, determination, and iron ambition. In the eyes of many analysts, it was the exact point where McDonald's stopped being a family business and became a modern corporation. With a structure designed to conquer markets, negotiate from a position of strength, and make decisions without having to justify every step, to founders who, although brilliant, no longer fit the stage that was coming. For the brothers, on the other hand, it was the end of a chapter that had begun with enthusiasm, experimentation, and disciplined effort. And that ended with a mix of frustration and resignation. It was not only about the money received, but about the feeling of having lost something more important: control over their own creation and full recognition of their role in a story that, over time, would be told from a perspective in which Kroc would become the main narrator. Once the purchase was completed, everything changed at a dizzying speed. Ray reorganized the internal structure, drove an unprecedented phase of expansion, formalized processes that had previously depended on verbal agreements, multiplied the brand's presence in new territories, and strengthened the marketing machine that would soon turn McDonald's into a global icon. The brothers' era had ended and gave way to a completely different one, an era in which the company would act with total freedom to build an empire based on standardization, replication, and massive presence. With the acquisition finalized and absolute control in his hands, Kroc could finally move the pieces without restrictions, and that new capacity would open the path toward the construction of a corporate culture that would define the course of McDonald's for decades. The birth of McDonald's culture. When Ray Kroc took full control of the company and the purchase of the surname was sealed in documents and silences, a stage began in which emotional restraints, contractual limits, and founding voices capable of questioning the strategic direction no longer existed. From that moment on, McDonald's became an organization designed to expand with iron discipline, supported by a vision that went beyond multiplying restaurants. What Kroc wanted to build was a culture, a universal way of operating that would transform every location, no matter how distant it was from the next, into an identical piece of a much larger mechanism. The goal was not simply to preserve the essence of the brothers' original system, but to turn it into a corporate doctrine. Every detail had to be formalized, from the way customers were greeted to the exact weight of the meat, from cleaning protocols to the order in which staff had to move inside the kitchen. Standardization, which had already been a crucial part of the concept since San Bernardino, was taken to a completely new level, because the business now depended not only on efficient operations, but on being absolutely replicable. The exact repetition of processes became a strategic tool and the foundation of a shared identity. For Kroc, uniformity was not a corporate whim, but an instrument to build trust. If a customer walked into a restaurant in Chicago or one in Phoenix, they had to feel they were inside the same universe. The same smell, the same speed, the same product presentation, the same experience. That predictability was a promise he considered essential to consolidating the brand in a country as vast and diverse as the United States. A promise that had to be upheld regardless of how many different hands were involved in the production of each hamburger. One of the most important steps was the creation of internal manuals that detailed every aspect of operations. Kroc understood that it was not enough to demand quality. It had to be explained, described, broken down into steps that anyone who decided to open a McDonald's could understand. The manuals became the cornerstone of training, meticulous guides that taught everything from the exact position in which machines had to be placed to the appropriate tone for serving a customer. It was such a complete system that, with enough discipline, it allowed people with no prior experience to become employees capable of running the kitchen flawlessly. Standardization also extended to architectural design. Buildings began to be constructed under a common pattern, with the golden arches as a visible emblem from the road, the same type of facade, the same parking lot, the same signage. The restaurant became a recognizable symbol, a reference point that motorists could identify even from a considerable distance, reducing the barrier of entry for new consumers and reinforcing the sense of belonging to a national system. The obsession with cleanliness was another pillar of this culture. Kroc was inflexible in this area and demanded standards that many franchisees considered excessive. Tables had to be spotless, restrooms constantly checked, display cases free of fingerprints, kitchens gleaming. Cleanliness was not only a matter of hygiene, but a declaration of professionalism, a way of conveying to the customer that behind their food, there was an impeccable system. This insistence eventually became one of the company's most distinctive traits, a differentiator from competitors that operated with less rigid structures. As procedures became consolidated, the company began to identify a problem that affected many franchises: variability in the training of owners. Some people quickly understood the philosophy of the business, while others applied the manuals with less rigor than required. To correct this dispersion and protect the model, Kroc decided to go further and create an institution dedicated exclusively to training future franchisees. The famous Hamburger University. Founded in 1961, this academy represented the purest expression of the control Kroc wanted to establish. There, the fundamentals of the system were taught, from inventory management to staff organization, including product preparation and cost administration. The purpose was simple but forceful. No franchisee could run a McDonald's without deeply understanding the culture that sustained the business. The university was not just a technical school. It was a mechanism to ensure that every new member of the network absorbed the corporate philosophy before opening their doors to the public. This professionalization of the model allowed McDonald's to leave behind its artisanal phase and enter a business stage of industrial scale. Kroc knew that international expansion was within reach, but to achieve it, he needed a solid foundation, a structure capable of withstanding entry into cultural, legal, and social markets that were completely different. And that foundation was the culture he was building, a set of uniform, non-negotiable practices, supported by an organization capable of ensuring that even the most remote restaurant operated like the one on the corner near his office. One element that reinforced this culture was internal discipline. Ray insisted that every team member had to assume their work with a level of rigor rarely seen in fast food at the time. Employees could not improvise, could not modify recipes, could not ignore procedures. Discipline was a form of respect for the brand, for customers, and for the collective effort that allowed the network to function in a coordinated way. This spirit of strictness, which might seem excessive for a hamburger restaurant, was one of the driving forces that allowed McDonald's to scale into a global phenomenon. As this corporate spirit expanded, the company began to experience a particular kind of internal cohesion. Franchisees no longer felt like small, independent businesses, but as part of a larger structure. They knew they could rely on guidance, training, and constant support. They knew that if they followed the system, results were predictable, and that security was a powerful incentive for attracting new partners. McDonald's was no longer just a fast food restaurant. It was an organized business community, with clear rules, a shared purpose, and a culture that offered stability to those who joined the project. With such firm foundations, the company was prepared for its next challenge, one that required even greater adaptation, creativity, and understanding of the outside world. Taking its golden arches beyond the borders of the United States and turning the system born in California into a global phenomenon. The golden arches conquer the world. When McDonald's culture was already firmly established in United States territory, with manuals, centralized training, cleanliness standards, and an increasingly refined franchise system, the company began to look beyond its borders. Because the country was becoming too small for the scale of ambition that had taken hold at the top of the organization. The idea that the Golden Arches could become a recognizable symbol in any city on the planet stopped being a fantasy and began to take shape as a structured plan, supported by something they already understood very clearly. The model worked, it was easy to understand, and it could be taught to people from completely different cultures as long as the core of the system was respected. The leap beyond the United States did not happen in an improvised way. The first countries had to be chosen carefully, because the initial results would shape the internal narrative about what was possible and what was not. The company selected markets where there was a certain affinity with the American lifestyle and sufficient purchasing power to sustain a fast consumption product associated with a modern image. Canada, due to its geographic and cultural proximity, was one of the first logical steps. Later came countries such as Japan, Australia, and European nations that were already immersed in processes of urbanization and mass adoption of the automobile. Each opening outside the country had something of an experiment, but also something of a symbolic declaration. The Golden Arches were not a local phenomenon. They aspired to become a global economic language. The greatest challenge was not only opening restaurants, but resolving a constant tension between uniformity and adaptation. McDonald's had been built on the promise that the customer would find the same experience in any restaurant in the chain. But the countries it entered had very different eating habits, meal schedules, religious sensitivities, and tastes. In some places, beef consumption raised concerns. In others, spiciness was almost a cultural requirement. In many, American portion sizes seemed excessive. The challenge lay in deciding how far variations could be introduced without eroding the identity of the brand. The solution was to develop a hybrid strategy, maintaining a solid core of easily recognizable products, the classic hamburger, the fries, and the soft drinks, while at the same time opening the door to local adaptations that showed respect for the culture of each country. From this emerged menus that exist only in certain regions, burgers with typical local ingredients, vegetarian options, or even dishes that moved quite far away from the original imaginary, but that functioned as a bridge between the global brand and the local palate. In India, for example, alternatives without beef were prioritized. In Japan, products with flavors closer to local cuisine were introduced. In Europe, buns, sauces, and portion sizes were adjusted to align with customer expectations. These adjustments worked as a subtle message. McDonald's brought with it a model imported from the United States, but it was willing to listen and adapt in order to earn a place in people's daily routines. At the same time, the exterior design of the restaurants, the logos, the uniforms, and the promise of speed remained practically identical, generating a sense of continuity that was very powerful. A traveler could land in an unfamiliar country, walk down a street full of incomprehensible signs, and suddenly see the golden arches and feel that, at least there, they knew exactly what to expect. In many places, the first McDonald's became a symbol of modernity, a kind of informal embassy of American popular culture. Young people came drawn by novelty, by advertising, by the curiosity of trying something they had seen in movies or television series. Families saw it as a different kind of outing, a place where the experience was so organized that it felt almost theatrical. The tray, the wrapper, the predictable flavor, the steady rhythm of people coming in and out. Around the restaurant, a very powerful idea was built. Being part of a larger world, of a globalized lifestyle that until then had only been observed from a distance. In other contexts, however, the arrival of McDonald's generated resistance. Sectors of society interpreted the expansion of the chain as a cultural invasion, a threat to local culinary traditions, and a sign of the advance of the most aggressive capitalism. There were protests, criticism in the media, and even symbolic boycotts in some cities. The brand became a convenient target for those who wanted to question the influence of the United States on the economy and culture of the rest of the world. McDonald's appeared in political debates, opinion pieces, and speeches about national identity. Paradoxically, that controversial condition reinforced its role as an icon. The company was not just a restaurant chain. It was a symbol that represented many different things depending on the observer. Modernity for some, homogenization for others. A business opportunity for local franchisees, a threat to certain traditional producers. Meanwhile, in strictly business terms, the combination of a replicable model, a strong corporate culture, and the ability to adapt locally was consolidating a worldwide network that grew year after year. Logistics also became an enormous challenge. Bringing the same product standard to so many countries required a rigorous supply chain, agreements with local producers, constant quality controls, and the ability to guarantee that the hamburger served in a neighborhood of Paris, Mexico City, or Tokyo met the same specifications as one in a suburb of Chicago. This forced the company to develop specialized departments to supervise suppliers, to invest in refrigeration and transportation systems, and to establish control protocols that became as important as the customer-facing counter itself. As expansion progressed, the map of the world began to fill with red and yellow dots, with the golden arches installing themselves on main avenues, in shopping centers, residential areas, and highway service areas. The visual effect was powerful. The brand became a kind of layer spreading across very different countries, a fabric of restaurants that formed a global network under a single identity. This ubiquitous presence reinforced another key idea. McDonald's was now a shared language. People from very distant cultures could understand one another by talking about menus, combo meals, and products that, with nuances, formed part of a common imaginary. In this context, the role of local franchisees was essential. The company maintained a high degree of control over operations. But it needed entrepreneurs in each country who understood the particularities of the environment, who knew how to negotiate with authorities, adapt to regulations, read consumption habits, and at the same time respect the central structure of the model. This alliance between a global headquarters and regional partners generated a very effective hybrid formula. The company entered increasingly diverse markets without having to manage everything from a distant office, and local partners gained access to a proven system with a brand power that would have been unthinkable to build from scratch. At the same time, the image of McDonald's began to appear frequently in movies, international advertising, music videos, and all kinds of cultural products, further reinforcing brand familiarity. People saw the logo on screens and then encountered it on the street in their own city. That blend of fiction and reality helped associate the name for millions of people with a very concrete idea of fast consumption, family entertainment, and a certain sense of belonging to a global culture. With the golden arches already spread across much of the planet, and the brand turned into a synonym for standardized fast food, the company began to face a new challenge that was no longer about opening more restaurants, but about deepening its relationship with the public, touching specific emotional chords, and working very consciously on a segment that would prove crucial for its cultural dominance: childhood and the new generations. The king of marketing and childhood. When McDonald's had already spread across half the world and the golden arches had become part of the urban landscape in dozens of countries, the company understood that the next great battle would not be fought only on the field of physical expansion, but in a much more delicate and powerful territory: the minds of people, especially those who were still building their memories, their rituals, and their preferences: children. At that moment, the company decided that it was not enough to be a place where people ate quickly and cheaply. It had to become an emotional setting, a space where moments were lived that would be fixed in memory as something more than just a simple meal. The first major strategic move was to surround the brand with characters, colors, and stories that turned a visit to the restaurant into a small fantasy experience. Figures such as Ronald McDonald appeared, that smiling clown who functioned as a brand ambassador, the protagonist of advertisements, events, school visits, and charitable campaigns. Around him, a universe of secondary characters was created, along with themed toys, child-friendly decoration, and a visual tone that transformed the restaurant into a place that children almost immediately identified as McDonald's territory. The company understood that if it managed to associate its brand with fun and play from an early age, it was building an extremely valuable long-term relationship. At the same time, television became a decisive ally. In an era when the television set was the center of the family living room and children's programming gathered millions of children in front of the screen, McDonald's deployed marketing campaigns designed with surgical precision. Advertisements full of color, catchy jingles, scenes of families smiling around perfectly arranged trays, birthdays celebrated under the golden arches, school trips that ended with a hamburger and an ice cream. It was not only product advertising, it was advertising of a lifestyle, of a shared moments, of rewards that parents gave their children on special occasions. But the key piece that consolidated this strategy was the creation of a format that mixed food, surprise, and collecting: the famous Happy Meal. The idea was simple and brilliant at the same time. Instead of presenting the child with a simple combination of hamburger, fries, and drink, they were offered a small experience package in a recognizable box with bright colors, illustrations, and inside it, a toy that was often linked to a movie, an animated series, or a popular character of the moment. In this way, the restaurant stopped being a place one went to only out of hunger and became a leisure destination, something like a mini celebration every time one walked through the door. From a business perspective, this move worked on several levels at once. On one hand, it strengthened the emotional relationship with children, who associated the logo with a feeling of joy and reward. On the other, it increased indirect pressure on parents, who found themselves pushed by the insistent requests of their children, fascinated by the idea of completing toy collections or taking advantage of temporary promotions. In addition, partnerships with major film studios and entertainment brands created enormous synergies. When an important children's movie was released, the Happy Meal became a tangible extension of that universe, multiplying the impact of the campaign. The company understood that marketing should not be limited to convincing the consumer that its product was good, but that it could create an ecosystem where the brand functioned as a meeting point between family, leisure, and habit. Birthday parties at McDonald's are a clear example of this logic. Offering party menus, reserved spaces, activities for groups of children, and in some locations even entertainers or play areas, turned the restaurant into a recurring stage for celebrations. The result was that, for many people, some of their childhood memories were inevitably tied to the brand. That party with balloons, those photos with Ronald, that day when the entire class ended up having a snack in the same restaurant. From an entrepreneurial perspective, this stage is a manual on how a company can evolve from product to concept. McDonald's stopped selling only hamburgers and began selling belonging, ritual, and emotion. The price of the menu was justified not only by what was eaten, but by the symbolic wrapping that accompanied it. And while on the surface, everything seemed like an innocent game, behind the scenes, there was a tremendously calculated marketing machine at work. Market research, concept testing, analysis of children's behavior, strategic selection of licenses, and a release calendar that constantly maintained a sense of novelty. Of course, this same strategy attracted increasingly harsh criticism as social awareness about children's nutrition and advertising aimed at children continued to grow. Health organizations, concerned parents, and academic sectors began to point out the contradiction between aggressive campaigns targeting the youngest audiences and the type of product being offered to them, loaded with fats, sugars, and salt. The discussion spread to the media and opened an uncomfortable debate for the company. To what extent it was legitimate to build such an important part of the business on an audience that still lacked the tools to question the advertising messages it received. Even so, from a strictly business point of view, the focus on childhood was one of the great accelerators of McDonald's cultural dominance. With each generation that grew up seeing that logo in advertisements, toys, birthday parties, and family trips, the brand embedded itself more deeply into the collective memory. For many adults, returning to McDonald's years later carried an almost nostalgic tone, a connection to their own personal history, something any company would wish to achieve in its relationship with customers. The company complemented this strategy with actions that presented it as a socially committed actor, especially in relation to children. One example of this was the creation of the Ronald McDonald House Foundation, which builds and maintains hospitality houses near hospitals so that families of sick children have a place to stay. These initiatives, in addition to addressing real needs, helped balance the company's public image, showing a philanthropic side that softened, at least in appearance, the criticism of its business model. With this web of marketing, experiences, and social actions, McDonald's finished consolidating a privileged place in the global imagination. For many, it was the restaurant of their childhood. For others, the symbol of an era in which fast food, mass advertising, and entertainment culture blended into a single ecosystem. But as the brand grew and became more omnipresent, Warning signs also began to accumulate about the consequences of that model, both in terms of public health and cultural and environmental impact, setting the stage for a phase marked by increasingly intense criticism and a deep reassessment of the image of the hamburger giant. Criticism, documentaries, and a reputation crisis. While McDonald's continued to accumulate new openings, memorable marketing campaigns, and sales figures that pleased shareholders, in parallel, a growing and increasingly visible current of critical voices began to take shape. Looking at the model through different eyes, it was no longer seen as a friendly symbol of modernity and fast consumption, but as a key cog in much broader problems. Poor nutrition, rising obesity, the impact on local food cultures, labor conditions, and the pressure that a brand of that size exerted on the environments in which it operated. What for decades had seemed almost flawless from a business perspective began to be viewed under a different light as society became more aware of the consequences of what it ate and of what lay behind each tray. In many countries, the rise in childhood obesity and diet-related illnesses created a climate of suspicion toward large fast food chains. And McDonald's, because of its size and visibility, ended up at the center of attention. The media began to link overweight statistics with the expansion of these restaurants. Associations of doctors and nutritionists spoke about the risks of diets loaded with fats, sugars, and salt. And little by little, the idea took hold in public conversation that a cheap and fast menu could carry a high long-term cost. The image of the family-friendly and fun restaurant began to mix with concern for the health of new generations. The media turning point arrived with particular force, with the appearance of documentaries that did not limit themselves to pointing out the problem, but dramatized it in a radical way, bringing extreme personal experiments to the screen. The most well-known example was the project of a filmmaker who decided to eat exclusively at McDonald's for an extended period and record the effects on his body, his medical tests, and his state of mind. That film, designed as a direct critique of the fast food model, had an enormous impact on public opinion because it translated into images something that until then had been discussed mainly in reports and specialized articles. This type of content worked as a loudspeaker for many concerns that were already in the air. Suddenly, millions of people saw condensed into an hour and a half of footage a narrative that connected obesity, sedentary lifestyles, aggressive marketing, and corporations that apparently prioritized profit over consumer well-being. McDonald's appeared as a recurring protagonist in these narratives, not only because of its products, but also because of its massive presence in working-class neighborhoods, near schools, and in spaces where the decision to eat at the chain was intertwined with the lack of equally accessible alternatives. To the criticism about food were added others coming from very different spheres. Environmental groups began to denounce the environmental impact associated with the chain. Disposable packaging that ended up accumulating in streets and landfills. Intensive consumption of resources to sustain meat production. A carbon footprint linked to transportation and the global logistics structure. Animal rights organizations pointed to the treatment animals received on supplier farms. Labor activists questioned the conditions of workers in the restaurants and along the supply chain. And anti-globalization movements used McDonald's as a visible example of an economy that crushed smaller local businesses. In many cities, the brand's locations became stages for protests, picket lines, and symbolic demonstrations. Boycott days were organized, pamphlets were handed out in front of restaurant doors, slogans were painted on nearby walls. The company, which had built an image close to family life and childhood, now found itself associated with concepts such as exploitation, cultural uniformity, and harmful food. The paradox was evident. What had served as an emblem of modernity was beginning to be seen as a symptom of a modernity that had gone too far. At the same time, the press echoed lawsuits filed by consumers or interest groups who accused the chain of promoting unhealthy habits or of not clearly informing about the content of its products. Even though many of these lawsuits did not end in convictions, they contributed to building a rarefied atmosphere around the brand. Each headline, each report, each televised debate added another layer to a public perception that was becoming more complex. Suddenly, eating at McDonald's was no longer a neutral gesture. For some, it became an almost political act, with connotations that went far beyond the simple act of ordering a hamburger. This phase of questioning did not only hit external reputation, it also forced the company to look at itself in the mirror. Inside the organization, tensions became evident between the logic of maximizing sales promotions, large portions, abundant menus, and a new social reality in which governments were beginning to regulate advertising aimed at children. Health experts were occupying space in public conversation, and consumers were starting to demand more information and more responsibility. The pressure was no longer coming only from activists or uncomfortable documentaries. It was also arriving from regulators and health authorities. From an entrepreneurial perspective, this period shows something that is often forgotten when the history of large companies is told. No model, no matter how brilliant, is immune to being questioned when the cultural context changes. McDonald's had built its success on pillars that for decades seemed unquestionable: speed, low price, fun, ubiquity. However, those same pillars began to be seen under a different light when society started to value health, sustainability, and culinary authenticity more strongly. What had once been a symbol of progress was now associated with excesses, imbalances, and side effects. For the company, the reputation crisis had a double effect. On one hand, it generated a clear erosion of its image, especially in urban segments and among younger generations, increasingly connected to critical information and alternative forms of consumption. On the other hand, it acted as a catalyst for internal change, because it became clear that it was not enough to keep doing the same thing while launching more creative advertising campaigns. The model required real, visible adjustments that could be demonstrated through actions, not only through slogans. Even with all these turbulences, the brand did not stop selling, and that is another side of the story. Criticism and consumption could coexist within the same society, even within the same people. Many of those who watched critical documentaries or read harsh reports about McDonald's continued to stop by the restaurant from time to time, whether because of price, convenience, habit, or simple inertia. That contradiction reflects well the type of relationship the company had built with the public. A mix of cultural dependence, comfort, and moral conflict. Over time, the accumulation of criticism, investigations, and debates cornered the company into a position where it could no longer limit itself to responding with defensive press releases or generic public relations campaigns. If it wanted to regain credibility, it had to demonstrate changes in its offerings, in its messages, and in the way it presented itself to the world. And it is precisely in that attempt to adapt its image and its product to a more demanding environment that the next stage opens up. Marked by salads, advertisements about ingredients, redesigned spaces, and a discourse aimed at showing a more conscious, healthier face, more aligned with the concerns of the new consumer. McDonald's responds: salads, changes, and green window dressing. When the storm of criticism began to grow too loud to ignore, McDonald's understood that it was no longer enough to defend itself, that the time for saying, "We have been misunderstood," had passed, and that the public conversation demanded something more than formal statements. It was necessary to make a move in the area most under scrutiny. What was inside the tray, what was communicated to the customer, and the kind of values the brand claimed to represent. In that context, the company entered a phase of transformation that blended real adjustments, very carefully calculated tactical decisions, and an intense image strategy aimed at reconciling the hamburger giant with a world increasingly concerned with the words health, transparency, and sustainability. The first obvious battlefield was the menu. After decades of building its identity around meat, French fries, and sugary soft drinks, McDonald's began to introduce salads, lower-calorie options, fruit in children's menus, yogurts, and variations that sought to soften the perception that the brand was synonymous only with heavy food that was hard to fit into a balanced diet. Menus filled with green icons, leaves, calorie information, mentions of fresh ingredients, and messages emphasizing concepts such as choice and balance. Suddenly, the same tray could hold a hamburger and a salad with a light dressing, a portion of fries, and a bag of sliced apples, as if the company were telling the customer, "Here are all the possibilities. You decide which path to take." In parallel, an intense campaign of nutritional transparency was rolled out. What had previously been hidden in hard-to-access documents began to appear on visible panels, brochures, websites, and signs next to the counters. Caloric content and product composition became accessible information, at least in appearance, and that allowed the company to send a subtle message. Consumer decisions are no longer wrapped in ignorance. Here are the data. You see them and you choose. From the brand's point of view, it was a gesture of responsibility. From the point of view of many critics, a way of shielding itself against future accusations. Another significant change came in the way ingredients and processes were communicated. Advertisements and campaigns began to show green farms, suppliers speaking directly to the camera, images of freshly cut lettuce, bright tomatoes, and rural families that seemed to be part of a friendly, almost idyllic supply chain. The words quality, origin, and control appeared again and again in official messages, as if the company wanted to clean not only its nutritional image, but also the perception of what lay behind each hamburger. The narrative stopped focusing solely on speed and price, and began to incorporate a story of care and responsibility. Environmental concern also became a field where McDonald's needed to move quickly. Years of criticism over the excessive use of single-use packaging, visible waste in streets and parks, and the chain's impact on key natural resources forced the company to introduce gradual changes in its packaging policy. Reductions in the use of certain materials were announced, recycling campaigns launched, agreements reached with suppliers to use certified paper, and pilot tests carried out with more sustainable packaging. In some markets, elements considered unnecessary were eliminated. Waste separation inside restaurants was promoted, and medium-term environmental goals were communicated. It was a way of showing that the brand was listening to ecological concerns and trying to reposition itself as a company that at least acknowledged the problem. At the same time, corporate discourse filled with words such as commitment, community, and social responsibility. The company strengthened the visibility of existing initiatives, such as housing for families of hospitalized children, programs supporting education, or youth employment integration projects. These actions, which undoubtedly had a real impact on thousands of people, also functioned as a symbolic counterweight to the image of a ruthless giant that had taken shape in certain circles. For McDonald's, it was crucial to remind the public that behind the logo, there were stories of help and cooperation, not just sales figures and aggressive campaigns. The big question hovering over this entire process was to what extent these changes reflected a deep transformation of the model, or, in part, a smart cosmetic operation that sought to adapt aesthetics and discourse to the new times without radically altering the essence of the business. From one side, it could be argued that introducing salads, fruit, nutritional information, and environmental improvements represented tangible progress compared to previous decades. From another, it was pointed out that the backbone of the model still revolved around the same flagship products, the same system of mass production, and the same commercial incentives aimed at increasing the average ticket. What is interesting, from an entrepreneurial point of view, is to observe how a company that had dominated the market based on a very clear set of rules found itself pushed to partially change those rules due to pressure from its environment, not by its own initiative. The lesson is clear. No company, no matter how large, can remain indifferent for too long to what society begins to consider unacceptable. Sooner or later, reputational, regulatory, and commercial costs make adaptation cease to be an option and become a matter of survival. In practice, many of these changes worked. A significant part of the public found in the new menu options a way to reduce the guilt associated with eating at the chain. Some parents felt more at ease ordering fruit instead of fries for their children. Nutritional information panels offered a sense of control to those who wanted to monitor more closely what they consumed. Environmental and social improvements, for their part, helped soften the discourse of more moderate critics, who acknowledged progress even while continuing to question the overall model. At the same time, a curious phenomenon emerged. While McDonald's was striving to project a healthier and more responsible image, competitors appeared that played on the opposite field, that of extreme product specialization, the exaltation of the artisanal, the gourmet, the local. Premium burger chains, author-driven coffee shops, and fast food businesses with the aesthetic of small gastronomic workshops found their own space in a market where a segment of consumers was beginning to value personality and uniqueness over global standardization. McDonald's, in that scenario, was forced to walk a tightrope. To remain the same, recognizable, accessible, and fast brand it had always been, without renouncing the essence that had made it omnipresent, while adding layers of modernity that would bring it closer to a more demanding and better informed consumer. The company could not erase its past, nor stop being what it was in its structure. But it did have room to nuance, adjust, and retell itself through new symbols, campaigns, and products. This process of adaptation coincided with another profound transformation that was about to change the rules of the game for the entire industry. The arrival of digital technology in the customer's daily experience. From the way food was ordered to the way people related to the brand. And there, once again, McDonald's would have to decide whether it would merely react or whether it would use its size and its system-driven culture to take the lead once more. Reinventing oneself in the digital era. When the noise around health, sustainability, and responsibility had already become part of the everyday landscape of McDonald's, another wave of change arrived that had less to do with what we ate and more with how we related to the world. The digital revolution, that silent transformation that first slipped into our pockets with smartphones and ended up reshaping the way we order a taxi, watch a movie, and of course, place a food order. And once again, McDonald's found itself facing the same dilemma it had confronted at other stages of its history. Adapt quickly or watch its enormous scale suddenly turn into a heavy burden that was hard to move. The first major shock came with mobile applications and home delivery platforms, which began to turn the experience of going to a restaurant into something optional. It was no longer essential to travel there, order at the counter, wait for the tray, and sit at a plastic table. It was enough to slide a finger across the screen, press a couple of buttons, and wait for the delivery person. In that scenario, any brand that was not available on the main platforms began to lose mental presence, to disappear from the radar of the customer who decided from the sofa what they wanted for dinner that night. McDonald's, accustomed to being the one that set the pace on the street, understood that now it had to be inside the consumer's pocket. The response was gradual, but forceful. The company signed agreements with the major delivery firms and, in parallel, developed its own mobile applications with ordering systems, personalized coupons, and loyalty programs. The purchasing experience began to split into two major worlds, the physical and the digital, and both fed into each other. The customer who stopped by the counter could receive a leaflet inviting them to download the application. The one who placed an order from the phone would find special promotions for pickup at the restaurant. The restaurant, which for decades had been the absolute center of the experience, became a node within a broader network where contact with the brand could begin in the living room at home, on public transport, or in the office. At the same time, locations began to be redesigned to integrate into this new logic. Self-service touchscreens appeared, those large panels where customers could build their order calmly, without the pressure of a line behind them or the rush of the counter employee. From McDonald's perspective, the change had several advantages. It increased the average ticket value by suggesting add-ons, reduced communication errors, and offered a more controlled experience than the improvised conversation at the register. For the customer, it meant a sense of autonomy and modernity. And it also removed part of the social friction for those who preferred interacting with a machine rather than with a person. The restaurant began, in fact, to reorganize itself around these new flows. Specific areas for picking up digital orders, separate counters for home delivery, more open spaces designed for a consumer who might not stay as long in the restaurant, but who still needed a minimally comfortable place to eat while checking a phone or a laptop. Power outlets were introduced, along with wireless internet connection, warmer and less industrial designs, with wood, soft tones, and an aesthetic closer to that of a modern cafe than to the classic roadside hamburger joint. It was an attempt to tell the customer, this place you have known forever also has a place in your new way of living. In parallel, the company began to exploit something that, until then, had been underused. Data. Every order registered in the application, every coupon redeemed, every time slot of consumption, every combination of products generated information that could be analyzed to adjust promotions, launch specific campaigns, or reorganize staff schedules. Ray Kroc's old instinct to measure, standardize, and optimize found in the digital era a far more powerful tool, because now the system could learn from the real behavior of millions of customers in almost real time. This technological dimension also extended into the kitchen, where processes became even more refined. Order management systems that organize priorities, screens that indicate preparation times, sensors that make it possible to manage inventory better and reduce waste, tools to anticipate demand peaks based on historical patterns and specific events, such as football matches, movie premieres, or holidays. In a way, the San Bernardino kitchen, the one the brothers designed with chalk on a tennis court, had become an intelligent machine connected to a cloud of data that fed it constantly. The impact of digitalization became especially evident in moments of crisis, such as periods when health restrictions limited physical presence in restaurants. While many independent businesses struggled desperately to adapt to home delivery and takeaway orders, McDonald's, with its structure already integrated into the digital ecosystem, was able to react with greater agility, strengthening channels that were already in place and adjusting its operations to sustain large volumes of orders outside the restaurant. That ability to adapt did not eliminate the difficulties, but it demonstrated the strategic value of having invested earlier in technology and logistics. However, this move toward the digital was not only a matter of efficiency, it also changed the symbolic relationship with the customer. The brand began to communicate through notifications, personalized promotions, messages on social networks, and interactive campaigns that invited participation in raffles, surveys, or viral challenges. The old television advertisement broadcast to millions of viewers at the same time coexisted with small communications aimed at very specific segments. Students in a particular area, users who had not placed an order for weeks, people who usually ordered the same thing every time. Marketing stopped being just a megaphone and became a segmented and constant conversation. In this context, the menu also experienced variations designed for an increasingly polarized audience. On the one hand, the classic products were maintained, those that represented the memory of the brand, the ones that gave reassurance to the recurring customer. On the other hand, fleeting offers were introduced, collaborations with celebrities, limited editions designed to generate conversation on social networks and activate the desire to try it before it was gone. This logic of permanent novelty fit very well with the dynamics of the internet, where trends last little time and public attention shifts rapidly. At the same time, the company experimented with more flexible formats. From small locations focused almost exclusively on takeaway or home delivery orders to hidden kitchens with no dining room, designed solely to meet online demand in neighborhoods with high order density. This type of operational innovation showed how the brand could split itself, continue to be a recognizable physical place to go with friends or family, and at the same time, an almost invisible service that arrives at your door without you ever seeing the sign on the street. From an entrepreneurial perspective, this digital stage demonstrates something that has accompanied McDonald's since its origins. Its true skill was never only making hamburgers, but designing systems capable of adapting to context without completely losing their identity. The company that once revolutionized the kitchen with an organized flow was now trying to master the touchscreen interface, the recommendation algorithm, and last-mile logistics. The essence of optimizing the process was still there. Only the tools were different, and the stage had become more complex. And while the brand was reconfiguring itself to remain relevant in a world of applications, delivery workers, and screens glowing at all hours, something deeper continued to beat beneath the figures, the processes, and the technological innovations. The fact that McDonald's, beyond its menu or its application, had become a mirror in which many of the tensions, aspirations, and contradictions of contemporary society were reflected. Beyond the hamburger, a cultural symbol. At this point in the story, when McDonald's has already gone through all its operational, financial, technological, and reputational metamorphoses, speaking of the brand only in terms of a fast food chain falls short. Because what began as a small experiment in efficiency in San Bernardino ended up becoming a symbol embedded in popular culture. An icon that appears in films, songs, works of art, political debates, sociological studies, and personal memories that have nothing to do with one another, and yet share that yellow background and those curved arches that are instantly recognizable anywhere in the world. If one mentally revisits the last decades of cinema and television, it becomes clear that McDonald's appears as a silent setting in all kinds of stories. Characters who meet to talk about life at a plastic table, teenage couples eating fries after high school, exhausted executives stopping by the drive-thru late at night, travelers pulling over at a rest area in the middle of an endless highway. Sometimes the restaurant is nothing more than background scenery. Other times, it is used as an explicit symbol of modern life, of accelerated rhythm, of globalization that makes a place in Tokyo and another in Madrid have the same layout of trays, chairs, and counters. That repeated presence has caused the logo to stop being merely a brand and to become a visual language that directors use to say, "This is the contemporary world." without needing to explain it with words. In music and in the advertising of other brands, something similar happens. References to McDonald's appear in rap lyrics, in pop songs, in stand-up comedy jokes, in internet memes, in articles that talk about mass consumption, and in campaigns that, even without naming it, play with the idea of the usual hamburger or the typical menu that everyone recognizes, even if the name is changed. When a company reaches that point, it stops belonging only to its shareholders and begins to belong, in a certain way, to the collective imagination, because it functions as a shared reference point that anyone understands. But perhaps where the symbolic dimension of McDonald's is seen most clearly is in the realm of globalization and capitalism. For some, the restaurant represents a promise of accessible modernity, a way of feeling connected to a global lifestyle that one has seen in films, advertisements, and social networks. For others, it is an emblem of homogenization, of the loss of gastronomic identity, of pressure on local businesses that cannot compete with its prices and its marketing machinery. In demonstrations against economic globalization, it is not uncommon to see banners featuring the McDonald's logo representing an entire system, as if that yellow letter alone were enough to summarize the tension between the local and the global, between the small neighborhood shop and the omnipresent multinational. At the same time, on an everyday level, the brand embeds itself in personal experiences with disarming naturalness. For millions of people, McDonald's is the place of the first birthday celebrated outside the home, the spot where they had their first adolescent date, the space where they had an afternoon snack with their parents after school, or the refuge they entered in the early morning hours during a long trip to have a coffee and something warm. The company has spent decades occupying the spaces of ordinary life, those moments that no one plans as major milestones, but that, when accumulated, build a biography. And that is why, when someone enters a restaurant of the chain as an adult, they often do not enter only to eat. They enter accompanied by a sense of familiarity that blends the present with scenes from the past. That emotional bond collides head-on with the criticism the brand receives. There are those who feel guilty about going, but still go. Those who reject the model on an intellectual level, but end up crossing the door on a rushed day or a day of craving. Those who criticize standardization, but appreciate that, when traveling, there is a place where they know exactly what they are going to find. McDonald's embodies that human contradiction between what one believes one should do and what one actually does when convenience, price, or nostalgia come into play. From a narrative point of view, the company constantly moves in that intermediate zone between immediate pleasure and conscious criticism. In some countries, the presence of McDonald's even came to be interpreted as a political indicator. For years, the idea became popular that two countries with McDonald's did not fight each other militarily, as a simplified way of talking about how economic interdependence and shared consumption could function as bridges rather than walls. Time has shown that this theory was naive and could not withstand the complexity of geopolitics. But it helps to understand to what extent the brand was used as a symbol of global integration. If there are golden arches in your city, in some way, you are connected to a network of economic and cultural relationships that link you to other remote places. At the other end of the spectrum, artists, photographers, and writers have used McDonald's as an object of critique or reflection, portraying lonely restaurants on empty highways, analyzing the architectural uniformity of its locations, or describing how the same menu is served under radically different social contexts, from affluent neighborhoods to areas with severe economic hardship. These works often use the brand to talk about much broader themes: loneliness in large cities, consumption as emotional anesthesia, the loss of traditional community rituals and their replacement by serial, interchangeable, and predictable experiences. For entrepreneurs and business analysts, McDonald's is an almost obligatory object of study. Its franchise model is analyzed, its real estate strategy, its corporate culture, its marketing campaigns, its mistakes and corrections, its crises and reinventions. It is taken as an example both to admire things it has done brilliantly and to warn about the consequences of growing without measuring the long-term impact on health, the environment, or reputation. Few companies so clearly concentrate so many lessons about what a well-structured organization can achieve, and at the same time, about the kind of ethical and social dilemmas that appear when that organization becomes gigantic. And then there is perhaps the most subtle terrain of all, that of ritual. For many, stopping by McDonald's after a concert, on a trip with friends, or after an exhausting day of work becomes a small personal rite. A kind of pause where the noise of the world stops and one enters a familiar and controlled space. The food does not change, the environment hardly varies. The procedure is always the same. In an increasingly unpredictable world, that degree of repetition has an evident psychological appeal, and therein lies part of its symbolic strength. It offers an experience so stable that it ends up functioning as a refuge, even if it is wrapped in plastic and artificial light. In the end, McDonald's is many things at once, and that multiplicity explains its cultural weight. It is a story of aggressive entrepreneurship, a case of business success, a symbol of global capitalism, a target of protests, a daily setting of personal memories, a laboratory of systems and processes, a mirror of consumption habits, and an actor that influences how we eat, what we consider normal in a restaurant, and what expectations we have when we cross the door of any fast food chain. When one brings together all these layers, the biography of the brothers, the relentless vision of Kroc, the real estate model, global expansion, the relationship with childhood, the criticism, the reinventions, and the cultural dimension, one encounters a story that, beyond the hamburger, functions as a map of how an economic empire is built, scaled, questioned, and transformed in the 20th and 21st centuries. And that is where it begins to make sense to stop for a moment and ask what any entrepreneurial person can learn from this journey, both from its brilliance and from its shadows. Business lessons from the Yellow Empire. If one looks at the full history of McDonald's from a certain distance, as if laying out on a table a timeline filled with small milestones, controversial decisions, and unexpected strategic turns, it becomes clear that behind the hamburgers, the marketing campaigns, and the yellow arches, there is a kind of living manual on how a business empire is built, scaled, and sustained in an environment that never stops changing, and also on the human, ethical, and reputational price that is paid when that ambition keeps pushing forward without looking too much in the rearview mirror. The first obvious lesson is born in that kitchen in San Bernardino, where the McDonald brothers decided to stop thinking about their restaurant as a place where food is cooked and began to see it as a system where every movement could be optimized. There lies one of the great learnings of this story. The product is important, but the system that produces it can be even more decisive. Hundreds of businesses have served hamburgers better than those of McDonald's, at least in purely gastronomic terms. But very few have been able to design a workflow so clear, replicable, and controllable. The massive success of the chain is not born so much from the individual taste of each bite as from the promise of consistency. You know what is going to happen, how long it will take, and how it will be presented. That predictability, applied with discipline, becomes a gigantic competitive advantage. From there, another key lesson emerges: the importance of renunciation. The brothers reduced the menu to its minimum expression, sacrificing variety to gain speed and consistency. Many entrepreneurs fall in love with the idea of offering everything and end up building heavy businesses, difficult to manage, incapable of achieving excellence in anything specific. McDonald's shows, with all its lights and shadows, that limiting the catalog can dramatically increase efficiency, and that the obsession with doing a few things very well executed can go further than the impulse to cover too many fronts. Behind every hamburger that comes out in seconds, there is a prior decision to cut back, simplify, and concentrate the focus. The arrival of Ray Kroc adds another layer of learning, this time a less comfortable one. His figure embodies that type of entrepreneur who sees an opportunity where others see a reasonable ceiling, and who is willing to take that opportunity to its ultimate consequences, even if that means making others uncomfortable, displacing them, or directly leaving behind those who were there at the beginning. Kroc understood that the true wealth of McDonald's was not in a brilliant restaurant, but in the possibility of multiplying that model until it became a national and international pattern. From an entrepreneurial point of view, the lesson is blunt. There are system inventors and there are empire builders. They are not always the same people, and when they meet, the outcome usually depends on who controls the contract, the capital, and the structure. The real estate move by Harry Sonneborn and Kroc is probably the most cited strategic lesson in business schools. McDonald's stopped being, in essence, a company that lives off tight food margins and transformed into a business whose financial heart is sustained by rents from land and buildings. That vision forces us to ask an uncomfortable but fundamental question for any entrepreneur. Does your business truly match what you think you sell? Or is the real value lever somewhere else? Sometimes the visible product is only the facade of a deeper mechanism. In the case of McDonald's, hamburgers are the pretext that allows an enormously powerful real estate model to be sustained. There is also a clear lesson in the conflict between the brothers and Kroc, a kind of warning about the clash between craftsmanship and scale. The founders wanted to protect their system, maintain a manageable size, live well, and preserve the essence, while Kroc pursued multiplication and was willing to stretch everything necessary to achieve it. That tension is repeated in countless business stories. The creators of a project end up facing the profile that arrives to scale it. From that clash often come drastic decisions, acquisitions, traumatic exits, and rewritings of the official narrative. McDonald's shows, with stark clarity, that the vision that ultimately prevails is usually the one accompanied by a better legal structure, greater control of assets, and an unbreakable determination to occupy the center of the board. Global expansion and internal culture will also leave valuable lessons. The obsession with standardization, centralized training, detailed manuals, and shared symbols like the golden arches create an identity that goes beyond each individual restaurant. Any entrepreneur who dreams of building something big can draw from this the importance of culture as an operating system. It is not just about written rules, but about a way of doing things that is repeated enough to become organizational instinct. McDonald's managed to get thousands of people in different countries, with different languages and customs, to operate under the same basic rules. And that is not achieved only through contracts. It is achieved through a clear culture, repeated relentlessly. At the same time, the use of marketing aimed at children and the construction of emotional experiences around the brand teach another side of the coin. From a commercial efficiency standpoint, the move is brilliant. Linking your product to birthdays, toys, movies, and family memories creates a bond that is hard to break. But that same strategy opens ethical debates that any mass consumer company should consider. To what extent is it legitimate to use all the resources of psychology, creativity, and repetition to plant your brand in the mind of a child? McDonald's became a master of that technique and later had to face the judgment of a society that began to see more clearly the impact those tactics could have on health and future habits. Waves of criticism and uncomfortable documentaries bring another lesson. Success does not shield anyone from scrutiny. For years, the company seemed to stay ahead of any questioning. But when the social conversation shifted toward health, the environment, and labor conditions, the brand found itself at the center of the storm simply because it was the most visible. Any entrepreneur who aspires to scale must understand that reputation is an asset as sensitive as finances, and that the cultural context changes. What is celebrated today can be seen tomorrow as irresponsible. Ignoring those signals usually comes at a high cost. The later response from McDonald's, with salads, nutritional transparency, sustainability campaigns, and a strong commitment to digitalization, shows an ability to adapt that also deserves attention. A company so large, with so many vested interests and so much internal inertia, has been able to adjust its offering, redesign its locations, integrate technology, embrace home delivery, and use data to refine its operations. That proves that scale does not have to be synonymous with absolute rigidity. The system that was once drawn with chalk on a tennis court has been rewritten on touchscreens, mobile applications, and connected kitchens. The lesson here is that true strength does not lie in staying the same for decades, but in preserving a core identity while everything else is updated. And beneath it all, there remains perhaps the most human teaching. Every decision that has taken McDonald's to where it is today has carried a cost and a benefit. The extreme focus on efficiency gave it the world, but often reduced it to a caricature of junk food in the collective imagination. Kroc's ambition built an empire, but left the original founders behind. Brilliant marketing created unforgettable memories for millions of people and, at the same time, fueled deep debates about the kind of consumer culture that was being consolidated. For anyone who dreams of entrepreneurship, the story of McDonald's is not a fairy tale nor a tale of absolute villains. It is a mirror that reflects difficult decisions, unquestionable successes, costly mistakes, and dilemmas that rarely have an easy answer. In that mirror, each person can choose what they want to imitate, what they prefer to avoid, and which lessons they take for their own path, knowing that, in the end, building a company is much more than selling a product. It is, almost always, leaving a mark, economic, cultural, and ethical, on the environment around you. This is where this journey through the history of McDonald's comes to an end. A story full of decisions, ambition, and lessons that continue to resonate today. Tell me in the comments what you thought and what topic you would like us to explore in the next documentary. If you are passionate about these entrepreneurship stories, remember to subscribe so you do not miss anything. Good night.